Hello, and welcome to my presentation on the Wandering Ghost Ship. My name's Armin Egger. I'm very happy to be here. I'm extremely excited for this entire conference, and uh, just a small note of maybe to make sure this isn't too anticlimactic. What I'm going to present is part of a larger project. It's part of my PhD. So if there are going to be moments of pointing towards research to come and open questions and things that I think would be interesting to investigate and stuff like that. That's the reasons I'm trying to give an overview of what interests me here and a bit of a broader look at the phenomena of ghost ships and of this figure that I'm calling the wandering ghost ship specifically. Okay, let's start. So there are two main parts to my presentation. Part one concerns the variety of ghost ships, and part two concerns the figure of the wandering ghost ship. Now, if we think about the variety of ghost ships, we have to realize that when someone uses the expression ghost ship, it is entirely unclear what they actually mean. So there are just such a huge variety of examples for this, and it's not always easy to differentiate them. So what could we mean by saying ghost ship? So the first possibility is that it just refers to a ship without a crew, or seemingly without a crew, which means that sometimes the story setup can be that there's a crew, there's a group of people discovering a supposedly empty ship, but then it turns out there's some sort of presence there. So that's the first setup. The second setup is a ship with a crew of ghosts, overlap with option one, of course. And the prime example of this is probably Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where his crew rises from the dead and pilots the ship home. Option three, a ship briefly glimpsed in the mist, often a harbinger of doom. Often there are lights involved that are peering through the mist. The harbinger of doom trope or motif that's often seen in Flying Dutchman stories, for example, where the idea is there's a ship traveling the open seas and then there's an encounter in a storm with the ghost ship and then bad things are going to happen. Number four is the setup that an abandoned ship or a derelict is found by a salvaging crew. That salvaging crew often very excited about the salvaging fee they're about to receive, and then they enter the ghost ship only to find supernatural happenings there. And that is really the most popular setup in stories, in movies. This is a kind of a formula, and it can get formulaic, but it can also be the starting point for really original twists and comments on the trope. And then there's number five, and that's the wandering ghost ship. And that's the one I want to focus on right now. So what's a wandering ghost ship? So very simply, a wandering ghost ship is the Flying Dutchman. The Ancient Mariner is a version of this, but I'm going to focus on the Flying Dutchman for what I'm going to talk about now. And what I want to argue in this presentation is that, first of all, the wandering ghost ship can be seen as one example among many of the Gothic wanderer figure. I'll talk about what that is in a second. But it can also be seen as a specifically nautical Gothic wanderer figure. And that's where considerations within the realm of the nautical Gothic or the literal Gothic, all those fun things we do here, will come into play. And I'll talk about that more when I get to it. So three questions arise then. What are Gothic wanderers? What makes ghost ships part of this tradition? And what makes them specifically nautical Gothic wanderers? So a first look at the Flying Dutchman story, a famous example here from Heinrich Heine in 1834, used in translation here. Very influential version, the first one that introduced this motif of the Dutchman possibly being redeemed. But that's not important for now. What's important for now is those very general features of the story that we see repeated again and again. And there's this idea of the Flying Dutchman never arriving in port, never being able to make port, so doomed to sail the seas forever, falling out of time. There's a skewed notion of temporality in play here that's exemplified in this story by the crew of the ghost ship sending a pack of letters, but the people who they're sending the letters to are actually long dead. And then we have this motif that we'll come back to of transgression or of hubris. And the Dutchman gets into a storm and he's warned, well, we shouldn't really sail the Cape here. Shouldn't we rest and continue this tomorrow? And the Dutchman says, no, never. And the passage here in Heine is, the Dutchman once swore by all the devils that he would get round a certain mountain. Its name has escaped me, in spite of a fearful storm, even if he would have to sail until Judgment Day. And this element of the story is then, of course, picked up on and repeated again and again. When the captain says, do I have to sail until Judgment Day? And then the devil says, okay, sail until Judgment Day. And so he has to sail for all eternity. So here's just a list of some general characteristics of the Flying Dutchman. He has committed an act of transgression or exhibited hubris. He's doomed to wander the ocean for all eternity. He regrets the action that leads to his eternal wandering, which is associated with a feeling of guilt. He exhibits a kind of bodily immortality, as opposed to the kind of non-bodily immortality that we see in ghosts most of the time. It's a figure from the past haunting the present, of course, like many ghosts, most ghosts. Sometimes there's a sense of heroic or defiant rebellion combined with the Dutchman's guilt, even though that's often rather quickly overshadowed by the guilt. And then we can have those questions. So what are Gothic wanderers? So I'm taking this term from a book by Tyler Tichelar, which is called The Gothic Wanderer, but I think I'm using it in a slightly different way than he does. So I use the term Gothic wanderer to refer to a figure that exhibits Gothic qualities or conventions that can also appear outside of Gothic literature. And this can include texts that were written before the first Gothic novel. So here's what Tichelar writes in his book. While a great deal of criticism has been written about wanderers in Romantic poetry, the distinct significance of the Gothic wanderer has been largely ignored. Like the Romantic poets, the Gothic novelists adapted the figure of the wandering outcast from Milton's Paradise Lost to comment on the French Revolution and its implications. While Romantic wanderers were primarily depicted as heroic rebels, by contrast, the Gothic wanderer suffers pangs of guilt and is often eternally damned for transgressing authority. And now we can ask what exactly is meant by transgression. That's not always clear, not always used in the same sense, and not always with the same amount of theological connotations. But we can also ask whether there's really such a huge contrast between Romanticism and the Gothic in terms of the wanderer figures. And I'm working based on the assumption that there's already this kind of Gothic strain to the wanderer figure within Romanticism. So there are areas of overlap, especially in terms of their alienation and their guilt. And this helps us see a continuity between those two traditions of writing. And there's a quote here from Jeffrey Hartman, which I think illustrates this continuity. And he writes, one of the themes which has haunted literature since the Romantic period is that of the solitary or wandering Jew. These solitaries are separated from life in the midst of life, yet cannot die. They are doomed to live a middle or purgatorial existence, which is neither life nor death, and as their knowledge increases, so does their solitude. And Lees adds the important observation that the wanderer, even in Romanticism, often carries a guilt burden. And I should note that the expression wandering Jew, I'm using this here as more or less synonymous with romantic wanderer figure, in the sense that the Romantics took the story of the wandering Jew, which had theological significance, in part very problematic anti-Semitic theological significance in part, and turned it into a kind of romantic hero figure, partially heroic and defiant, partially doomed and outcast and exiled. So that's just about the use of this term here. So here are a few characteristics of the Gothic wanderer. They've committed an act of transgression or hubris. They're doomed to wander the earth for eternity. They regret the action. And I think you see where this is going, because when we ask ourselves, does the Flying Dutchman fit into this scheme? Or the ghost ship, we see that those lists are exactly the same, with one exception, and that is that whereas the general Gothic wanderer figure is doomed to wander the earth for all eternity, the Flying Dutchman is doomed to wander the ocean for all eternity. And what we can do now with a broadly speaking nautical Gothic framework is look at, well, what are those exact nautical qualities that make this a different kind of Gothic wanderer figure? So how do we not just say, well, it's the Gothic but at sea, but what is the actual deeper influence of this? And this is all in the context here of the idea of the Gothic conventions being transformed in nautical writing, as Emily Alder has pointed out in her introduction to the nautical Gothic issue, and as many people working within the field of oceanic studies and blue humanities and nautical Gothic and literal Gothic and haunted shores have, of course, stressed and worked on this idea of taking the sea as primary. So this is the framework that I'm going to work within, and that I want to situate this idea of the Gothic wanderer, the nautical Gothic wanderer in particular. And just to bring this point home, or to stress this again, I've picked two elements of this list to indicate how they might be fruitfully worked upon with this nautical Gothic lens. So the one point is the Flying Dutchman as having committed an act of transgression or exhibited hubris. Here we have the captain swearing at the storm, and he's convinced that he can defeat or control nature. And this is more than just a general act of rebellion or transgression. This is actually human superiority over nature, human control over nature, an instrumental relation of humanity to the natural world. Seems like these are explored in Flying Dutchman myth. And the other part of this, if the figure is doomed to wander the ocean for all eternity and not just the land, I believe the vastness and the instability and the fluidity of the ocean adds a dimension of horror and terror and dread. And this is, I think, very nicely expressed in this quote by McMullen, who says, paradoxically, the wide space of the ocean, apparently a scene for movement and expansion, can be as restricting in some circumstances as a coffin. With that, I will end my presentation. Thank you very much.